Good evening, everyone. This is Lori Charlton. It's November 15th, 2024, and this is a special meeting of the Fund Balance, Borrowing, and Debt Service Subcommittee of the Board of Finance. My Board of Finance colleagues, Craig Curley and Amy Ruggiero, are members of this subcommittee, as am I. I'll call the meeting to order and ask that we rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. To the members of the public who may have dialed in or joined us by Zoom, you're muted. There will be no live public comment until called for during the meeting. I'll open up for live public comment on any of the agenda items before we begin. And if you would like to make a statement, we ask that you limit your comments to no more than 3 minutes. Members of the public are always encouraged to send comments via email before or after our meetings to bof@fairfieldct.org. If you do so, please remember to include your name and address as you would with live comment. Also, if this is the first time you're joining as a member of the public for this subcommittee, I would encourage you to also listen to our organizational meeting last month on October 17th, where we spent a fair amount of time talking about the goals and objectives for the subcommittee. With that, we can move right into item 3. To discuss, consider, and act upon a statement of short-term objectives for the Fund Balance Committee. Can I have a motion to hear this item? Ms. Ruggiero, seconded by Mr. Curley. The backup for this item. So this item we reviewed at our last meeting, but just deferred the vote. So this has not changed. And we discussed it in some detail at the last meeting. So does anybody have any questions or comments on this?
No.
Okay, great. Okay, and we can move this to a vote. All in favor of approving the statement of short-term objectives for the fund balance, what do we call it now? Debt service. Fund Balance, Borrowing, and Debt Service Committee. Please, as published in the meeting backup, raise your hand. Okay, great. It's unanimous. All right, so we will move to item 4, to hear and consider town recommendations and committee input regarding the current fund balance policy. So the backup for this item is the Board of Finance's existing fund balance policy, which is posted online and starting on page 2 of the backup. We heard a presentation at our last meeting from the town's financial advisor, Phoenix Advisors, on a benchmarking of our fund balance levels compared to other AAA rated communities in Connecticut. So this policy is here. David Becker, who's the town's interim CFO, is here. And I can open it up for comments on the policy from the board. I had a couple things, but if I'll go last, if anyone else has comments on this.
I had some questions on the guidelines after we get to page 3, but
Okay.
I'll defer to Amy if she has anything for that.
I don't have anything at this point.
Do you want me to talk about the guidelines or do you want to wait to get there?
I had a couple small things. You want to go page by page?
Yeah. Well, you know.
All right.
Do we, just one thing, Lori, do we have, this is the current policy.
Yes.
Do we know right now, is there anything that the administration has shared with us that they would like to change?
On the fund balance policy?
Not specific to the fund balance policy.
So no on this one. I know that
Not on this.
this is the next item. Okay.
Not on the fund balance.
As of right now, you're not proposing any changes.
Well, I just had a couple things. So on page 1 of the policy, which is page 2 of the posted backup, we list here governmental fund type definitions. I think we should add here proprietary type funds, because proprietary type funds that would capture the internal service fund as well as enterprise funds. And I think that's important because I think fund balance on the internal service fund was not addressed in this policy last time. So maybe it's, I just, that's a comment for later, but maybe we consider incorporating that in. So I would just, rather than governmental fund type. So governmental fund type has a specific meaning in the financials. So I was going to propose just changing it to government fund type definitions and then adding, I'll get the technical definition, but proprietary fund type. And those are funds that operate like normal GAAP basis accrual accounting, like the internal service fund. So I think that should be in there. And then I guess we've sort of talked about this quite a bit in the past, just as we've looked at the funding levels for the internal service fund, but just wanted to throw it out to the committee and maybe the administration. If we should consider establishing a fund balance policy for the internal service fund. Because we don't have one right now. We only have one for the general fund. And the internal service fund has built up a pretty healthy fund balance. I think it's, I don't know, $6 or $7 million, something like that, which this first came up as a big topic a couple of years ago in the budget where because that fund balance had gotten so large, this board voted to actually cut the contribution to the internal service fund to zero. But it's been sort of an ad hoc thing looking at that fund balance, and we've never actually had a policy around it the way we've had for the general fund. So I'm just throwing that out there as a thought and I wanted to get everyone else's thoughts. I don't think it would be the same policy as the general fund because the internal service fund that's where we have all our health insurance reserves and our workers' comp reserves, and there's a lot more estimates and uncertainty there. But yeah, I feel like we want to make sure we have a fund balance there, and it should be, and I don't know why we wouldn't have guidelines around that. So I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that.
No, I do. I mean, you mentioned it. I think it was 2 years in a row, we chose not to fund that from the operating budget. And it was because we expected levels to basically stay within a certain range. But you're right, that's based on where we were at the time. I do agree that there's some uncertainty there, but it's also somewhat predictable. So I think it should allow itself or lend itself to follow some type of guideline or policy. And if we feel like that, I think that administration should be able to use that policy to say, okay, if we're going to fall, if we expect to fall below a certain level, we need to add it to the budget. But absent that, there wouldn't be a budgetary contribution.
Yeah, I mean, that would get you from getting away from the issues, in the past.
Yeah.
Sort of force you into what they didn't do at one point.
They weren't funding it enough.
Everybody around here, but at one point they weren't, and it was going, if I
We
understand.
had a negative fund balance, yeah.
Yeah, it went negative on an accrual, then it went negative on a cash basis, and then that's where we got the ratings. The negative outlook piece was in that era. Obviously, a lot of people work very hard to maintain it and sort of add the do no harm, but to codify that into a policy so that it made, it essentially made sure that we at a minimum kept it at that level based on, and on that world, I would go and do it as, you'd make sure that on both cash and accrual basis, you always maintained at least some sort of a level, right?
Yeah. And
Slightly above par too. So
the first year that we chose not to fund that most recently, a couple of years ago, it was met with a lot of resistance by this board because, that was just a change. And like, we always tried to basically offset withdrawals from that fund so that we tried to maintain, but there's other activity that kept adding to it, which is why it was growing. That wasn't being taken into consideration, but that initial resistance was simply a function of a lack of policy. And I think last year we followed the same process. We said zero contribution and it was fine. I think it passed unanimously. But I think nobody wants us to allow that fund balance to drop below certain levels. But I think we should feel comfortable not to contribute to it if we see other factors that are continuing to add to it. So I think we should write something.
Yeah, no, that would be healthy.
I think we're at, I'm trying to go, I could be wrong, but based on memory, remember when we first looked at that for the budget that year? I want to say it was like 45 or 50%. It was the level was something like 45 or 50% of the average expenditures out of that fund. So it was a big cushion. So to the extent that's supposed
It's
to be
grown.
a cushion, you've already accounted, you're on an accrual basis. So you've accounted for all your existing liabilities, all your incurred but non-reported claims, all that's already in the liability. And then you had a fund balance, which I think was like roughly 40–50% of average expenditures. So it should be something. But the reason I think we cut the contribution to zero that year was we said you'd have to have everything catastrophically go wrong all at once to need a fund balance of that magnitude. And so I'm not saying it should be like 10% or 11% like the general fund, but maybe there's a range.
Well, the other thing that I recall we looked at was the coverage, right? I think we looked at the trend coming out of that fund and we said we had like 6 or 7 years of cushion here. Yeah. And so that's another way to look at it too, based on a certain withdrawal rate and how many times coverage do we have on that?
Okay.
No, that would be.
And I don't know if it might be beyond the scope of what this committee wants to look at least for the next several months to say what that, to agree on what that should be. But I think at a minimum, maybe getting consensus from the board that we do want to have a policy on that. Okay, so that was just one comment. And I think my other one was so on page 2 of the policy, which is page 3 of the backup. I'm sorry, page 3 of the policy, which is page 4 of the backup. Am I on the right place? Okay. So our current range for fund balance, so it's under the guidelines section. And, oh, Craig, this might be where you are. Did you have a comment on that first one?
Yeah, just looking at the ceiling, we're
Yeah,
already
the
over
ceiling.
the ceiling.
Same comment. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I definitely agree that we should have a floor. I don't necessarily know that we need to have a ceiling, but right now we're over the ceiling anyway. So certainly we need to address this in some manner.
It's guideline.
Yeah, it's a guideline, but if we're specifying a range and our range right now is 7.5 to 11, and we're at 11.75, and we've been actively maintaining it at that level. I feel like we're out of the policy, so maybe it should just be 12.
I think the 7.25 number, I think, if I recall at the time when this was put in place, I was on the board and we were literally sitting at that number or about to cruise to.
Right.
So why exactly 7.25? I'm pretty sure it was, okay, here's where we are. We don't want to be below it, but you might even just tweak that and round it up to 8 and say the reality is.
Yeah, I mean,
12
to 12 or
I mean, you're not gonna go below. It's so catastrophic for us that we'd probably not do that and issue general obligation or something if we're really back into a corner because you're not touching this money, right? So
we went from 11 to 11.75 one year, I think. And I know that was not intended, but
and so, yeah, and so the wording this year in the resolution was specifically to
Yeah.
avoid an accidental, when the dust settles, having to do that. So we've become more, cognizant of that because I think the intent was to park it at that 11. To your point.
yeah. But I guess my point is that if we set the ceiling at 12, then it doesn't leave us a lot of cushion to contribute to it if we wanted to.
right.
Right.
So
Maybe it's 8 to 15 or something like that. And looking at that chart that you're looking at right
Yeah.
there, that's perfect. I was thinking about that. We're still on even if we went to 15%, we're still on the low end of that range.
yeah, so what I'm looking at, and Amy, you might remember this from last time, Jim, we had this presentation from Phoenix where he showed us the fund balance percentages for all the comparable.
All the
AAA.
various towns around.
Yeah, and we were in like the lower quartile. That's where we were. At this point, it says 10.7%. So we're higher than that now, but even with even at 11.75% where we are, we're in the bottom third of the AAA communities. So, and the very lowest on here, which is Greenwich, is 9.1. So, you know, I mean, the way, you know, we might not want to be, I mean, I agree. Like maybe 9 to 15 or something.
Yeah.
I feel like we should do something with that range though, because we're out of the range for several years and we're doing that intentionally because we don't want to take it down.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, and just thinking back to the internal service fund or the debt, service account. I think there are other places that we can be stronger perhaps than our peers and still give potential flexibility. The difficulty is when we put the money there,
I want to take
then
it.
we don't have the flexibility. So if we park money in some of those other funds and we, even in a guide, we wouldn't go lower than, but maybe set a range, and continue to strive to have a healthy balance. At least you can turn to it.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, so,
May I?
yes, of course.
So on that point though, so yeah, on other areas where maybe stronger, for example, pension funding, things like that. So I would be concerned if you put it at 15, do you actually want to contribute each year until we get to 15? Or so if it's set at 15, somebody's going to come along and say we should be contributing. And if that's not what the intention is, then, I mean, maybe we should do, we are AAA rated, so somehow we must be okay with our fund balance. And when taking everything into consideration. So the only thing I would worry about is, in future years, if people think we should be getting to
Be there.
15, they will be spending money to get to 15 or setting aside.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd want to take, hear the administration's thoughts on, if the range were changed, what it would be. I mean, if there's a concern about going higher than where we are, and we've been intentionally trying not to go, like we've actively over the past 2 years now, not wanted to put more money in fund balance because we don't utilize it. It sits there, it earns interest, but it's cash it's taxpayer money that's captive. So if we wanted to keep it close,
We do 12.
yeah, it could be 12 on the ceiling and the floor maybe goes to 9 or something to reflect, at least there's some basis for that. It's the lowest level that any AAA community is. So we don't have to decide on that now, but that's just my.
Yeah, I would just say if we have a basis for wanting to get to 15, then make it 15, but if we really don't.
I
You know,
think if
you're
we
kind
were
of-
gonna get to 15, it would, to me, if you're gonna go to 15, you'd want to have a willingness to use it when you needed it. And some communities did that, like I know West Hartford did, I know Monroe did, I think Westport may have too, but there were communities that used fund balance during the pandemic.
Yeah.
When they were trying to keep taxes flat. We did not do that. So unless there was a different philosophy, like we have this hold harmless policy. So if we're gonna hold harmless, then you probably don't want to get too high.
right, that'd be a question, we can go back to Matt and try to have the conversation if we wanted. If we set it as it's 9 to 12, between 12 and 15, we may, in these instances, dip into it. Is that if we're still in that range, what does it do? But everything that we seem to be told is if we go near that, and maybe the pandemic was the one time that they didn't go after everybody about it. But it just seems like the last place that we'd want to start really plunking money down. So I guess to the first selectman's point, right now, we exceed our 11% policy. If we put it at 12, we're sitting right at the top end of, our policy. If you go to 15, now we're 3 points behind. And I think when we did do the 11, and I say we, because I think I actually voted at the time, that was an absolute intent to get it up to that level.
So
Okay.
what if we were to define a range and actually give a suggested target as the midpoint of the range? So that we're not setting ourselves up for a board to turn over and people to say, hey, let's get to the top of this range. Give a target that's the median or midpoint or whatever we want to call it.
And maybe we could take that back to Matt too as a question. I mean, he's usually like
Yeah, sure.
person for that.
Just a question, are you concerned that the 7.25 is too low based on what we're seeing on the chart there?
I am.
I am, yeah.
That's what the issue is, and
In both,
Using
yeah,
that as the
the 7.25 would put us.
it does seem low
substantially
given
below.
what the towns are, so I would question the too low, but I'd be apprehensive to go too high.
Yeah,
Because,
same here.
like to Mr. Gerber's point, I wouldn't want to go at 15. Because I just think that if we're having, ways that we can trigger use of it, we're gonna put us in a position where we can't access it should we need to, for whatever the reason might be. So I could see changing the low starting point, but I don't know that I would want to go much higher.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, to get it up there, there's a cost to the taxpayers to increase that. And I think the first year that we stopped budgeting for surplus was the pandemic year. I think we cut it to 0 that year for that reason, because we were trying to get to a 0 mill rate increase. And prior to
First year
that,
off the board and we always,
yeah, prior to that, we were budgeting surplus. It was part of the mill rate to try and increase that. So now we're there.
But it wouldn't cost the taxpayer if to change the 7.25 to 9, for example, that does nothing, because we're
No, that does
already at 10 and change, right?
11 and 3/4, yeah.
and at a minimum, just to maintain right now, you essentially have to take 10% of the general fund and put it in there. So you're spending a couple $1 million a year goes into that fund no matter what, just to maintain. So non-budgeted currently, but.
Because it's a percent of the budget. So every year that the budget goes up, you have to put a little, you know, and the way it's been getting funded these past few years is we've let surplus fall through and sit there, which I think is appropriate, but, okay.
But as the budget's grown in real dollars, that used to be, 1.1 million, now it's over 2 million.
Yeah.
So it's real dollars.
I did have one other question. We've often talked about the hold harmless policy. I
Yep.
don't see the word, that phrase in here at all.
Now,
It's in here. Let me see
I
if I
searched
can
the
find it.
document and I couldn't.
Yeah, it doesn't
Do
say
no
it's
harm?
harmless though.
Huh?
It says,
No harm?
I searched.
I
on
don't think
harm.
it's actually in there, but I think that was like a.
here's where it says it. Okay, it says, because as I read this, it doesn't say hold harmless, that's the concept, but it says here. Where does it say it? Yeah, so right below 1, 2, 3, and 4 under the guidelines. So during the yearly town budget process, all town bodies involved in the budget process shall budget to increase the unassigned fund balance by budgeting an expenditure in the budget for surplus, which will be no less than a dollar amount that is equal to the same percentage each body increases, if at all, the total expenditures from the prior year's expenditures budget, in order for the unassigned fund balance to be maintained from year to year on a budgetary basis from the previous year. So all those words say, we want to budget surplus in order to keep it at the same percentage.
Okay.
Now,
However,
however, we have not budgeted
That's it,
surplus.
right.
We've used surplus. So that was, I had that
And
comment.
it's a guideline, but
and it also doesn't say anything about actually contributing to maintain. It just says you have to budget for it.
Well, that's what that means, right? Budget. We have that line item called budgeted surplus, which is an actual expense line in the budget.
Sure, but if we budget to maintain and it's exactly $2 million, then that's what we put in. And when you put $2 million in actuals, it may move the number up or down.
well, I'll give you the current example. So when you get to the quarterly later, you looked in the backup, right now we're showed to be at 0, which Caitlin has told me in like 20 years, that's even on a Q1, you've never at that point. But when we really look at all the variances, we are really, even with all the ebbs and flows, very tight. We get to the very end and we're actually at 0. There is no line in the budget for it. It'll have to come from somewhere. Now you can make a transfer out of debt service or somewhere else to do that, but it isn't budgeted. We used to always budget it. And I get with all the surpluses and other factors and starting in the COVID year and trying to be cautious, all the reasons not to, but that was why it originally was in there, was to guarantee you had the money. Now, back then, we didn't have big debt service accounts either, or any surplus sitting in the internal service fund.
But I guess my thing was, I think this language should be tweaked anyway, because we're not following this policy. This says we shall, budget and expenditure in the budget for surplus, which will be no less than a dollar amount equal to kind of hold harmless. So the
There's gotta be
reason
some.
we haven't done it is because for years we've been running these big surpluses and we've just assumed they'll always be there. And we can use that instead of putting it in the budget. So let's just say this year, that's not the case.
Right.
Two things have to happen, or three things could happen, right? We could take it out of debt service, that money that we've put away, that we thought we'd be able to use for other things in order to maintain it. Or the fund balance as a percentage is gonna come down because it's not getting replenished because we didn't budget for it. Or, we budget a number twice as big the next year. So this is, all I'm saying is that this language in this policy, we have not followed. And so I think unless we intend to start doing this, and I think times have changed. You're right. This was written at a time where we came from not having a fund balance and we were trying to build it up. Now we're like, okay, we've got a fund balance that we're all comfortable with. We want to keep it within a range. But I think instead of saying we shall do this by budgeting and expenditure, I think we can say what we're really doing. We can either budget an expenditure or allocate surplus
So
or,
that the actual-
or otherwise plan so that we stay within the target range defined by this policy, whether that's 9 to 12 or something else.
No, I agree. To the point, it's a guideline, but you should have a
Right.
backdoor on there for your alternatives, especially when you know you're using them.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, so that was my comment. And then I think on my next comment is on, and maybe what we can do after this discussion, if we want to propose markups before the next meeting.
Okay.
Because ultimately, all we're going to do here is take these recommendations to the Board of Finance. But I think on page 3 of the policy, which is on page 4 of the backup, it talks about acceptable uses of unassigned fund balance. So when we say here, so it's down on the bottom, it says the circumstances in which unassigned fund balance can be spent down. It's on the bottom of the 3rd page. So right now it says, can be used under following circumstances: operating emergencies, unanticipated budget shortfalls, unanticipated shortfalls in the internal service fund. I think that's, I don't object to this wording. I think the wording's fine, but maybe 2 things to think about. One, we should specify that we're talking about the unassigned general fund balance, especially if we're going to add an internal service fund policy to this. And then if we are going to have an internal service fund policy, I guess we can leave this in here anyway, but we shouldn't. I'm not sure we should be replenishing shortfalls in the internal service fund through the general fund balance. I mean, unless it goes negative or something, and if we have a policy for the internal service fund, then that shouldn't happen anyway, because we're budgeting for that. So
Budgeting for, and you should be leaving cushion.
Yeah.
To some degree.
right.
But if there is a year where there's lots of
Yeah.
claims or something like that, and now we drop below our floor in the internal service fund, then we can. fund
Yeah,
it.
so we can leave that in there, but I would just again specify that we're talking about the general fund balance here. If we agree that we should add something for the internal service fund.
If there's no policy on the internal service fund, how do we know if we have a shortfall? What are the guidelines?
I mean, if we have an actual, so years ago, the internal service fund's on an accrual basis. So we had an actual deficit in that fund because we have long-term workers' comp liabilities in there. And they weren't getting the liability wasn't getting completely funded. We were sort of funding it on a cash basis, but we weren't funding the full long-term liability. So when you So again, this is normal GAAP basis accounting. So when you looked at that fund, it had a deficit. And it didn't cause a problem, we, on a cash basis, we were fine, but on an accrual basis, we had a deficit. So if they, so previous boards got that funding up to where, it was, the long-term liabilities were covered in that fund, but now they're covered and there's a huge fund balance. So,
There was a year where it then dipped on a cash basis when everything settled.
Yeah.
That was where the rating
that was the year we
agencies
got
caught it.
the rating.
That was
agency.
sort of the wake up call on, okay, we need this up.
Right now, where we stand with the internal service fund is we have all of our long-term liabilities covered
Covered,
and then some.
yes.
And then if we were to create a policy, we could make a, like, can you take money from the internal service fund and fund the general fund today? Or above that? We don't know.
Yeah, I don't think
We'll see.
we've done that. I think we've sort of done that by not putting, so the internal service fund has to cover all of the healthcare and workers' comp payments.
Mhm.
So the past 2 years, we haven't put money into it to cover those payments. We just used the existing funds that were in there and turned out that the estimates were too high anyway. So we made the payments out of that fund and still maintained the fund balance that was there. So, yeah, does that answer your?
I was just wondering, because you said all known liabilities are covered for the full extent.
But they're estimates, yeah, so.
But, if there was excess there, we were to design a new fund, with the 3 examples you just gave with having to fund, if we were to have a shortfall, could you use some of that excess?
Yeah, I think we
Fine,
effectively
fine.
did that last year by not putting any more in. So we paid by not putting any money in there, we essentially let that fund
Right sized it.
use that, yeah, we use that to cover, so what's in there is workers' comp liability, health insurance, and general liability. And general liability is always, it's a big
That's slip
estimate.
and falls,
It's a
right?
big estimate for, yeah, any kind of litigation. And so the contribution to that fund historically over the years, we have a separate budget for insurance to put in there. We have a separate budget line item for workers' comp to put in there. The general liability was always covered by this budget contribution that we called risk management. And we put that in there. And that's the piece that we haven't funded for the past couple of years. So effectively, we've been using fund balance to do that.
Is it a big number as a percentage of the, should be there? I mean, is it,
Is which one a big number?
well, I mean, we're saying that there's like an excess.
Yeah,
Is it 10%? Is it 2%?
no, it was like 40 or 50%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the fund balance, yeah, of the current expenditures, yeah.
Oh. So it's gonna take a while to.
Yeah, I mean, but you could have a bad year. You could have a year where you have like, you're really under budgeted on your health insurance claims. That's why you want to, because, if you're self-insured and you think your health insurance claims are going to be, $10 million, and they turn out to be 13 million, you could wipe out.
Yeah.
Now, that hasn't happened because I think the town's gotten some pretty good advice from our insurance brokers, and we've not, the past several years, if anything, we've been conservative on those. We haven't found ourselves in that situation, but, something could go wrong. And so,
Even in the increased percentages that we factor in and the snapshot of time that we use, I mean, there's numerous layers of washing there.
Jim, we were talking about on this fund balance policy, should it incorporate a policy for a fund balance in the internal service fund? Which we don't have right.
No, we could use the fund balance to pay the internal service.
We can, but the internal service fund on its own, there's no policy that says it has to have a fund balance,
Yeah.
So that's what we were just.
There has been in the past, not in a long time, wild swings,
Yeah.
crazy swings and negative balances on the internal service fund.
Yeah.
The last having to do with, originally it was from the town side. But then it went, and then the Board of Ed was complaining that, oh, you're using our money to cover your internal service fund. And lo and behold, within 2 years, they had the biggest swing ever in the internal service fund when their numbers went all negative. So it could happen. we have less exposure to that because the Board of Ed is not
It's in the state
self-insured.
plan, yeah.
State, so it's, you know, become a little bit more predictable.
Yeah, the only other comment I had on the policy was, on the last page, it says, this is page 4 of the policy, page 5 of the backup. It's the policy for replenishing deficiencies. So the second line says, if at the end of a fiscal year, the unassigned fund balance falls below the floor, the Board of Finance shall prepare and submit a plan for expenditure reductions and or revenue increases. I feel like that should be the town, should prepare and submit a plan. I mean, that's effectively the budget, is what we're talking about. So that's, and then it says the Board of Finance shall take action necessary to restore the unassigned fund balance. I'm okay with that. That's our vote on the budget.
Yep.
But I think that the second sentence, it should be the town, because that means the town has to, you know, for whatever reason, fund balance got too low. The town has to submit a budget that corrects it, so.
But this also kind of implies that hold harmless is a budgeting exercise and not an actual. Because the only action we would take here is if the fund balance dropped below the floor, not if it dropped below where we were last year. So,
I guess in a scenario where, let's just say you had a situation where the budget, something happened with the budget. We were too low. We budgeted too low on a bunch of things, like, or we budgeted too much revenue. And as a result of that, we end up with a deficit in the current year budget. So you have to go to fund balance. I think what this implies is that if that happens, you have to prepare and submit a plan, the town would, to get that back the next year.
Yep.
And I think that's appropriate. I just don't think the Board of Finance is responsible for preparing the plan. I think the town has to do it, and then we have to take action, meaning vote on it. Vote it up or down or amend it or whatever.
That makes good sense to me.
Well, what happens, I mean, we do these quarterlies because we project on how we're doing.
Yep.
Along the way, and, you know, I would hope that we would know what was going on during the year. And
Yes.
the town hasn't addressed that. And we find ourselves at the end of the fiscal period. I think it would be the board's role at that point to jump in and say, okay, the town hasn't done what they were supposed to do. They haven't rectified the problem. And now here we are at the end of this process. What are we gonna go a whole nother year without, the budget's done. The budget was set in March or April, and then gone through the town boards.
Yeah.
I think the thought was when we wrote this was, okay, now we're at the end of the fiscal year. We now have to correct this.
but if we've set the budget in March, April, approved in May, mill rate set, like.
And gone through the quarterly, you know, we're having a disaster that's approaching.
Right, but our only action would be to budget for it in the next cycle, right? Like, there's nothing else that we could do.
I think we could do stuff right away. We could change the budget. We could reassign money. We could say, okay, we gave you money to do these capital projects in the budget. Maybe we're gonna take that money away and not do those capital projects. There are things that we could do by moving money around. We're taking money out of budgets.
Fair enough.
And I think that was the thought, that if it really gets to the end of the fiscal year and this hasn't been corrected, then this body would have the right to make those changes.
So it would be a net zero budget adjustment. We take from this left pocket to put over.
Yeah, we're not gonna, we still gotta meet the budget.
Yep.
But we have a right to then go in and do what we needed to do by shifting money around out of budgets. Obviously meet with.
Could we,
Yeah, obviously meet with the town, get their recommendation.
But could we actually, we can do transfers,
Yeah,
but we couldn't reduce an appropriation.
we could reduce the budget. We can move money around anytime we want if there's still money in the budget.
But in total, like reduce an appropriation, the total amount of the appropriation during the year?
I believe we have the legal right to do that.
Okay, can I,
You can get the town attorney to
Okay.
weigh in on that if you'd like.
okay, yeah, that's,
And my only concern with all of this that we're talking about is this piece of the policy talks about only a scenario where we've gone below the floor, which is like 7%.
Yes.
It's not about going below 11.76 and going below.
That's the target. Yeah, that's what we're trying to get to. It would be if we really got that bad.
Right, but if we move the floor up to 11, for example, it wouldn't take that much to
No.
drop it below. Okay.
yeah, I think, and I'm with you, Jim. I just, what I was trying to say is I think would be the administration's responsibility to do that. It's not just on the board, like, you know what I mean? And so-
Areas I'm thinking about or what happened.
Yeah.
Like something drastic, like a major storm come by and
Right.
they not decide to fund it with debt or to do something else, but I think there would be time all along this time, for the board at least, to say, what's the plan from the administration? What's the plan? What's the budget? Okay, now a budget's been approved. Now we're at the end of the year. And we not only, we've normally been saying, what do we do with the surplus? No, that wouldn't be the problem.
Right.
Okay, now it'd be the opposite situation. Yeah, and, I would be interested in hearing from the town attorney on it.
I think we might get to the same, only because it says, right now it says the Board of Finance shall prepare and submit a plan. And then the Board of Finance shall take action necessary to restore the unassigned fund balance. So I think even if you said the town shall prepare and submit a plan, which it should be the town's responsibility, it still leaves the Board of Finance says shall take action necessary. So if they didn't submit that plan, then yes, we still have the right to do that. Maybe it's a little bit of a tweak, but I feel like the reason I made the comment is I think the town, the administration should understand it's their responsibility, the administration or the Board of Ed. And the Board of Ed kind of goes through, or the central office seems to go through this every year. You're running over on one element of costs, and so they hold back and they do the things that they need to do to manage their budget so that they hit it at year end, right? So it's that I believe is, management's responsibility. And I think the second line item says, yes, the Board of Finance shall take action necessary. So if they didn't do it, but that, so I hear you, but I will take that as an action item to ask the town attorney how that would work in terms of an appropriation. And Jim, just to catch up, so I think, I don't know if anyone else has any comments. The one thing we just tossed around a little bit before you got here was the range in here.
Sure.
And what it should be. And we just conceptually threw around a range of 9 to 12, only because we're above the ceiling at this point already. We're at 11.75, so we're technically out of the policy guidelines. And I don't think there's anybody is pushing to lower that. And then 9% is the low end of the range on this Phoenix report. Town of Greenwich is the lowest of all the AAA rated communities. They're at 9. I think the 7.5%, according to Mr. Becker, was the level where the town was at when this policy was first written. So that was kind of the starting point. So, we're not voting tonight or making any decisions, but we were just talking about that.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, are there any other comments on this? All right, so what I would ask then is, and we can get input from any other board members that would like to give it, but it would be good if for our next meeting, the committee members or anyone else wanted to recommend the actual wording changes to this, or the administration if you have, so that we can talk about those. And anything we voted on, again, would be only a recommendation to the full Board of Finance. It has no force on its own, but to get more specific about these things we've discussed.
If we have that legal opinion prior to, we can get that before the meeting.
Yeah.
Help us with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. Okay. All right, so we can move on to item 5, and this is to hear and consider recommendations related to the town's borrowing policy Oh, actually, before you do this, is there anyone, I don't think there's anyone on for public comment. I was gonna ask for public comment and I didn't, but I don't see anyone there anyway, so, okay. All right, so item 5 is to hear and consider recommendations related to the town's borrowing policy, including recommended levels of planned capital spending and related debt service projections. So the backup for this item is the existing debt issuance policy. It was posted late today, but it was also posted for the last subcommittee meeting. It's a document that's been publicly available. When we talked about revisiting this policy, we talked about it more from the standpoint of, at least in my mind, and I'd ask anybody else for what their thoughts were. I think this is a pretty good policy as it stands, and I think the 10% makes sense. But I think what we talked about quite a bit is if the policy is going to be 10%, should we have a targeted guideline below 10% to allow for any unanticipated spending or projects that go over budget, et cetera. And we wanted to hear from the administration on what their thought process was around that level. So I don't know, Mr. Becker, do you have anything for us?
Yeah, I can circulate a draft of this. I'm not sure that we concretely put this much into it.
Okay. Maybe just talk to us about kind of the bottom line and then process.
Yeah.
Comments.
Yeah, and the bottom line is 9%, which is what we had talked about.
Okay.
Once, what do you think?
And so yeah, the bottom line being 9%, which is what I believe we mostly focused on. And I'd say page 1 and 2 are relatively similar. But the idea is that if we go deeper than that, it may unnecessarily cause us to then not make investment that's necessary. But at the 9% target, we're a full 10% below from a breathing room perspective. And that there should be some sort of guideline that is sort of makes it deliberate if you're going to go over that 9%. And that particularly it won't necessarily immediately have an effect, but it has an effect in many years. So you really want to be conscious about, there was some, there was a major project with an unforeseen overage. There was some sort of an emergency that came up, and it would have to be pretty substantial in order for that to, it'd have to be pretty substantial for us to actually do that. Just going a few $1 million is unlikely to, cause you to suddenly go that far over. And there's there's plenty of different numbers you can pick. Is it 8 or 8.5? Things like that. But we've learned that by keeping our targets that low, it's potentially gotten us in the position that we are in now, where now we're actually faced with this dilemma of how difficult it is to stay underneath that, because it's so expensive, after delays and at a time of massive inflation. So it's like end rates and other, so, it steers you to, a point of caution, but not too deep. So,
Okay, so 9, all right.
but
Just
9% is our.
Mr. Kareem?
Yeah, a couple of questions. What calculations or math did you go through to determine the 9%? Obviously, it sounds like there's some cushion there, but it's hard to know without understanding the math that went into it, whether one project going over by, 20% can cause a problem, or maybe 9.5, maybe the should be 8.5, maybe it should be 9.5, but I'm curious about the math that went behind it.
So in other words, how much, so 9% gives us how much in terms of dollar cushion annually?
You'd get 10 right now. I mean, just off the top of my head, it's worth about 5 million or so in planning, but we could put something together that shows you exactly what that quantifies.
One of the
It does kind of cascade out.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about is like when we looked at the capital budget or the capital waterfall that you guys had prepared earlier, and we kind of started to look, we were at 8.1, we were 8.4, we were just getting it slightly over 9. And I was curious, like if these projects went over by 10 or 20%, or if they got delayed, like at what, this is a big shift that takes a long time to turn around, so you can't get too close to the 10%. But I was really curious to better understand how much over does a project need to be to eat up this cushion? And because it may be that even 9% is too conservative and we can afford to go to 9.5 with enough warning. And then the other half of this is 9% at what point? This year or at any point in the next 5 years? Because when we looked at that schedule, it was 8.1, it was 8.4, it was 8.7. We didn't get over 9 until year 5 or 6, I think. And then we were all starting to worry like, oh, do we have to slow down? But I was thinking, does it get better if we actually accelerate projects and then not necessarily add to the list, but spend a little bit less by accelerating this project and avoiding that hump later? Like, I really want to better understand both the cushion and the timing for this 9%.
So you want to see this spreadsheet with the numbers?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can put, we could certainly take, potentially literally just take projects themselves out and throw the larger numbers on the annual in and see how that cascades out and do a little bit of modeling on it.
Just take the model and put either a negative number in or a positive number in and see what it impacts. Bill, did you have a?
Yeah, so in our current capital plan, well, first of all, it depends on the project, right? So if it's Dwight and we're gonna spend 65 million on Dwight, then going over 20% is a big nut. But most of the projects are pretty small, 1, 2, 3 million, and they're spread out throughout the year. So you would have, if one goes over 20%, you would be able to adjust if that's gonna knock you over, but it would require on the magnitude of like, a few million a year, per year, like 30 million in the total 10-year period to knock you over the 10% or to get you to the 10%. So, there's infinite number of iterations, I think, but you could, we could define, like what would happen in reality, I think, is that we would be able to see if we're going over because the projects are relatively small and no single project is going to knock us over the 10% unless it's one of these massive school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and for me, I think when I saw that we were going over 9% in year 6, for example, that didn't necessarily give me heartburn.
I think it was, we got to almost 10%. Yeah.
Okay, but even when it's that many years out, I recognize that we have to be careful not to start something that we can't undo later. But could we address that differently? Like, again, is the 9% target, is it going to be for this year? Or is it going to be at any point over the next 5 years?
It's not going to be a problem for this year at all because it's amortized over 20 years. So there's no project that, unless it was outrageously over by a multiple, it wouldn't knock us out.
Right, but even if we were comfortably under this year, but we knew we had a $65 million project a year and a half or 2 years from now, and that will put us over. Now we have to try and manage that in advance too, right? So
Exactly. So, yeah. So they all build up and they're all amortized over 20 years. So moving something up it's only you're going to start amortizing that off earlier. It's not really going to help.
We actually made it worse. And I'd say there's two factors as well. So, I mean, just looking at that plan, had we used the last 5 years and took out probably the outlier years for our budget growth perspective, number, it would actually start to reduce those down. I think we took, if I remember correctly, a longer range and actually factored in, budget growth percentages that were the inflationary era. You know, everyone's guess is as good as, but when you start to tweak the numbers around, you can do a lot of different things. I think the goal here was that when you, let me just mention the 9.5, and I know where you're going. You know, it's really hard to go back down the other way. I mean, I you know, again, reference my time, but I lived through the era where we were over that and we were trying to reel it in. I think we went too far, and it's about finding sort of the sweet spot from a planning and existing level. But if you start to creep up, it really takes time to bring it back down to earth.
My only point about accelerating project though is we've seen this with too many projects recently where we end up spending more later because we didn't do it sooner. And, you know, I rather this town spend $10 million on a project this year instead of $15 million on a project next year.
So the other pieces we're focusing very much, I know the discussion is on the 9% or 10 or 9.5, you know, where you float within there. We've still got to be able to roll all these numbers up into the debt service and then actually be able to do it at a reasonable mill rate. And that's going to take years to get to that point at any thresholds.
Yeah, that's my question. Is we roll it up to 9, what does that do to tax increases? I'd like to see those numbers. We're going to really take it up to 9. We're going to use 9. Make a capital plan based on 9. Tell me what that's going to do to the mill rate. How much debt service is going to increase? We've taken it up to 9.
Over 2%. So, I mean, because we're below 7 now, right? And this is a percent of the budget, so it should be should drop straight down to the mill rate.
And I think that that's our, and you know, be it Dwight or WPCA projects that are now moving into, you know, partially into the town side, or you name it. You know, that capital plan, and I know we said it again at the summit. You know, we are going to have to take, you know, that is all of the projects, and based on the existing timelines given, there are going to have to be difficult decisions that are made before we come back in the February or March timeframe after the work of this committee and come to the boards and start marching towards what we're actually going to bond next year. But you're not going to take year one at, I believe, $54 million. You're just not going to be able to go from the mid-30s to the mid-50s right off the bat. That has an immediate impact within about 18 months, because a half-year payment and a full year, and it goes right to the bottom line. And then if that's where we're at, it's just going to compound after that. So we are going to have to, over the next few years, continue to cautiously wade into any level of these increases, because it's just not going to do it to the taxpayer. It's not feasible. And that will actually have an effect cascading out on when we get to, we've reached the 9%. That may have an effect of putting out projects and compounding for years, but it also doesn't let that tranche of debt now into the schedule. So about some.
How long has the policy been 10%? I don't know if it tied to this back page that says 2011.
Yeah, that's probably, yeah, I don't know if this was an update in 2011 or if it was created in 2011. We have our resident historian just joined us. Mary, do you know if this current debt policy, this says updated April 2011. Was this new at this time, or was it, do you remember?
Don't remember.
Okay, so we've had this for 13 years anyway.
So I guess I'm not following. Why would we want to change it from 10% to 9%? Like, I don't understand. If 10%, we're already concerned we're going to get close to that. Why do we want to box ourselves in even tighter? We're going to go, I mean, that makes it even harder for them.
Yeah, no, and that's what I was saying. I wasn't, at least the way I was thinking
This is
about it
proposing
is,
to change it to 9%.
no, we would not be changing the policy.
Like an
We're
early
basically
process.
saying, if this is our policy, then sort of as a supplement to that, the planning guidelines don't plan to get to 10% in your plan, because that leaves you, because then if anything goes wrong, or if you go over, you're going to be out of your policy. So if you plan to be below it, you have some room, which was what Craig was asking, whether that's 5 million annually or whatever, a cushion before you hit that point.
Yeah, because for example, if Dwight proceed forward with Dwight and they end up $10 million over or whatever it is, and we're kind of committed, you got to finish the project, right? And now all of a sudden that's going to push us over, so they need to plan for a lower level so that if they do go over, we stay within the 10%.
I got it. You're not proposing changing the debt. Servicing, I guess.
I mean, that was I wasn't thinking of.
Yeah, no,
I think we were just thinking of a planning guideline to go along with the capital plan that said, you know, in order to keep within this policy, there has to be a level of budget. And I would just say too, and this is sort of along the lines of what Mr. Curley said, and I think what Mr. Becker said, you know, you can't turn this ship quickly. When, by the time we get 5 years out, if we're at 9.9%, like that plan says, it's too late. Like that 9.9% is based on stuff that's already been approved. And you can't just reduce it because that's debt you owe. So I think that was Mr. Becker's point. It takes a long time to bring it back down. So that's the one thing, that's one reason why you want to be cautious. To Mr. Curley's point about do you ratchet up earlier, I think that gets to the point of, you know, not having crazy spikes in the future, but being on a glide path. If this thing is gonna increase. So I don't have anything. I know we have a few other,
Yes.
Oh,
Mr.
yes, of course.
Becker, what's the one well, that would be there for reserves for emergency and for things? What does that 1% calculate out to right now?
I think you're gonna get back to us on.
Yeah, that between 9 and 10, so essentially we can get back with what that would look like calculation wise, but essentially that's 10% of the plan. It doesn't exactly hit that way because if you do something, like right now, if it's more how it affects the outlying years, so it isn't simply just taking 10% off, but in very rough math, it's 10% plan.
So for 350 million, 35 million is 10%, so $3.5 million. 1% of debt service.
Well, no, well, it's,
Well, we have a $500 million capital plan, so 10 million,
10%
10% would be taking 50 million out of there.
10%, exactly.
Okay.
It's 10%, roughly it's 3% of, you'd have to shave 5 million expenditure. But it's not,
I think he has to get back to us.
Okay.
I want to, we have a few more agenda items to get to here. I want to make sure we have time. We have a hard stop, but, so you're going to get back to us on, so the question is to quantify this 9% in terms of dollars and say what that means to the capital plan and just bring that next time. So say if this is the plan, put in like a negative number or a positive number in there so you could kind of see the impact. Ms. Leclerc?
Just so I had a chance to settle down, I think that was a revision to that policy.
Okay,
And I also wanted to say is, we've been here before.
yeah.
And when we had approved like both high schools and had middle schools and elementary schools all being renovated at the same time, we were bumping up against those limits. And the biggest thing you have to be concerned about is that it affects your budget every year. Because if you're at those limits, you have no place to go if the mill rate doesn't increase. So if you have no expansion of the mill rate, you're going to have an increase in taxes. So if you have contracts that have to be funded or insurance going up, those are the really hard questions then because you have no place to go.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think everybody's. All right, so, so the action item will be to come back with that quantification. I think,
We could, because we're looking at a specific percentage, we have it be, that percentage be 8.75 and 8.5, just so we can see what.
like a range? Yeah, okay. Can you do that, David?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. All right, so we'll move on to item 6, to hear and consider an update on the WPCA long-term financial plan. I don't know, I see Ms. Ford is online and Matt Man, who is WPCA. David, I don't know if you want to kick off and maybe they can
Yeah,
And then as necessary, tell us where that stands. And let me step back. So for background and for the public, our current capital plan has a substantial amount of expense in it related to WPCA projects. The current capital plan had an assumption that the WPCA would finance all its own project for a certain period of time, and then the financing would have to revert to the town. And so the request was that a long-term capital plan, or I'm sorry, a long-term financial plan for the WPCA be created and be reviewed so that we could understand exactly how much they could afford, what those projects look like, and start the conversation of where those things would be financed. So what is the status on putting that plan together?
so the initial legwork of the plan did begin after the last meeting. We do have the framework of data, but our budget director at the time, who's since left the town, was the one who was heading that up, working with everybody. So at the time of his resignation, that got put aside because wrapping up in preparation to budget was largely the focus. So we do have that initial work product, but we're gonna need to focus on adding that over the next few weeks. So for tonight's purposes, we really don't have as much as we had hoped to be able to present based on that. We are internally meeting. Our next date is Thursday with WPCA, and the focus, part of it is going to be driven by the capital projects. And one of the things we're working on is really making sure that we have accuracy with that. And that's something that, Michelle now, as the general manager, has been doing a lot of legwork on going through the Wright Pierce report, the allocation that this board and others had appropriated. And sort of the validity of all those numbers to back in. So that has continued on because that was independent of specifically, the budget director, but we're trying to wrap that up and then take over the next steps.
So what do you think the timeline is going to be then on that?
I would say probably second or third week December. I'm not sure when you're.
And does the commission, how is the commission going to, I see Matt here, but I assume that this is going to be prepared and has to be reviewed by the commission as well, right? So how is that going to work?
Yeah, it'd be helpful if it lined up with the dates with the commission before coming here. This is obviously a subcommittee that is, not making a final determination on something. So you saw a draft version of it. I don't think it's a mess, but for instance, if it had all worked properly, schedule wise, it would have been tomorrow night on their agenda. Right now, it's not on their agenda. So, we look for December meeting, which is mid-December for them to review.
So probably
it's gonna help with-
a plan probably, but we're talking about, we're going to vote on a meeting schedule later, but we're going to try to meet monthly. So it sounds like we wouldn't have a really substantive update until our.
This is Michelle Gore. I would say probably in early January, because this would not be brought to the commission until the December meeting, which is December 18th. So our hope would be to have the draft, as David suggested, we would have that prepared by mid-December, and then we'd be able to present it to the commission at that time.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Any board members have questions or comments on this? Okay, thank you for that update. Okay, so we can move to item 7 to hear an update on the progress on the townwide capital plan. So again, background for the public, our current capital plan was that's why we're here. Got us to the tipping point in terms of debt service projections, and the plan was for the town and the Board of Ed, Board of Representatives to sit together and start to look at and reprioritize projects. Can you tell us where that stands? I know we have the superintendent here later, so we can ask him as well, but is that process ongoing?
Yes, there's been several meetings internally to kick that off, working towards be able to go out on the RFP and it's and then the actual allocation, which this board had approved, goes before it went to the committees for the RTM last night and goes on Monday for the full, approval, at which time we'll have the actual allocation, spent the money. But there's now been several meetings between town and central office staff, including getting some of the town side staff to the facilities to do the first round of that as well, because some of them had, Board of Ed knows it, but the town side doesn't. So at least it's now on a weekly schedule at a minimum in post communication. So they took that and didn't just wait for the final RTM and said, all right, let's start moving in the right direction.
Any questions from the committee or board members? Okay. All right, so I'm glad to hear you're meeting weekly. That's great. All right, so we'll just move to item 8 then. Consider and act upon a meeting schedule for the subcommittee. So can I have a motion for this item, Mr. Seconded by Ms. Ruggiero. We had a document in our last meeting, but we didn't end up voting on it because we had to get over some technical hurdles for this committee. But I'll just throw out the dates, which I think we had talked about last time anyway. So they're moving a little bit because we moved this meeting to tonight. But I would propose that this subcommittee meets on December 5th. That would precede the normal Board of Finance meeting that night. January 9th and February 6th. Each meeting at 6 p.m. And that's consistent with what we talked about last time. And the idea of that is to kind of work backwards from February. So the Board of Finance gets absorbed in the budget process in March. And typically we're aiming to approve capital projects before that budget process really begins. So working backwards, the idea would be that by February, this subcommittee finishes its work and gets ready to make recommendations to the full Board of Finance based on the objectives that we approved earlier. And at that point, we have a revised capital plan so that that's completed in order to guide those project approvals that will be before us. So to get there, these 3 meetings would allow us hopefully to be ready to make recommendations to the Board of Finance during February. So does that work for everybody? December 5th, January 9th, February 6th. Sheriff?
January 9th and the February 6th dates before the Board of Finance meetings.
So we don't have a schedule for next year yet because we don't have our organizational meeting yet. So
Those are Thursdays, right?
yeah, they're Thursdays. And the reason I did January 9th, I suggested January 9th is because we always run into a little bit of a right before the holidays. We try to do something like right after New Year's. Everyone's been out and it's kind of hard to get things. So I thought that might be a standalone meeting. It just gives a few days after the holiday, I think, to have everyone, kind of get our act together, if you will. And then February 6th is, yes, that's also a Thursday. That was a little selfish on my part. I don't think I'm available on the 4th. So.
That's fine.
So if that's okay with the rest of the committee. And that's just so we don't have to do special meetings and we can vote on it, get minutes and all that stuff
Yep.
done.
Yep.
Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, all right then. So then all in favor of adopting the following meeting schedule, December 5th, 2024, January 9th, 2025, February 6th, 2025, with
6
each
p.m.
meeting at 6 p.m. All right, thank you. That's unanimous. Okay. All right. With that, to item 9, I take a motion to adjourn. Mr. Curley, seconded. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our Board of Finance colleagues for joining.